Hidden beneath the floorboards of a decaying Oregon cabin lay a secret the world forgot 80 years ago. When a desperate woman seeking a fresh start broke the rusted padlock on the basement door, she didn't just find dust. She unearthed a multi-million-dollar mystery that someone was still willing to kill for. The rain in the Pacific Northwest didn't just fall, it oppressed. It soaked through the dense canopy of the Willamette National Forest, turning the dirt roads into treacherous rivers of mud. Madeline Hayes gripped the steering wheel of her battered Subaru until her knuckles turned white, her eyes straining through the rhythmic slashing of the windshield wipers. She was exactly where she wanted to be, entirely off the grid, miles away from the wreckage of her former life. At 34, Madeline was fleeing a catastrophic divorce that had left her financially drained and emotionally hollow. Her ex-husband, a high-powered corporate litigator in Chicago, had systematically dismantled her career in architecture, leaving her with nothing but a modest settlement and a desperate need to disappear. When she saw the online listing for a 5-acre property deep in the Oregon woods, priced at an impossibly low $35,000, she bought it entirely sight unseen. The local real estate agent, Evelyn Reed, had practically begged her to reconsider over the phone. "Madeline, listen to me," Evelyn had warned, her voice crackling over a poor cellular connection. "It's not just a fixer-upper. It's a tear-down. The property has been abandoned since the mid-1940s. There's no municipal water. The electrical grid is miles away. And the locals, well, nobody goes up to the old Caldwell tract. It has history. The bad kind." But Madeline hadn't cared. She craved the isolation. She needed a project to rebuild her shattered confidence, a place where no one could find her. As the GPS on her phone finally lost its signal, the dense wall of Douglas firs parted to reveal a small clearing. There it sat. The cabin was a hulking asymmetrical structure built of dark, weathered timber that seemed to sag under the weight of decades of neglect. The roof was a thick carpet of vibrant green moss, and the front porch slumped dangerously to one side. It looked less like a home and more like a tombstone marking forgotten memories. Madeline killed the engine. The sudden silence, save for the drumming of the rain, was absolute. She grabbed her heavy canvas duffel bag, a crowbar, and a high-powered flashlight, stepping out into the biting chill of the autumn afternoon. The front door, swollen with moisture, refused to budge until she wedged her shoulder against the wood and shoved with all her might. It gave way with a horrific screech of rusted hinges. The smell hit her instantly, an overwhelming cocktail of damp earth, decaying pine, and a strange metallic staleness that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She clicked on her flashlight, sweeping the beam across the living room. It was a time capsule of decay. Tattered floral wallpaper peeled in long, dead strips from the walls. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far end of the room, choked with the petrified remains of birds' nests. In the center of the floor lay a massive, braided wool rug, its colors long faded into a uniform, moldy gray. Madeline spent the first few hours doing basic triage. She cleared the dead leaves from the immediate perimeter, set up her camping cot in what used to be a parlor, and started a small fire in the hearth after painstakingly clearing the chimney flue. As night fell, the forest outside transformed into a wall of impenetrable black. The wind began to howl, rattling the single-pane windows in their brittle frames. It was around midnight when she dropped a heavy log of damp cedar onto the floor near the hearth. Instead of a solid thud, the impact produced a strange, hollow boom that reverberated beneath her boots. Madeline froze. She tapped her boot against the floorboards. Solid. She stepped a few feet to her left, onto the edge of the ruined wool rug, and stomped, boom, hollow, boom. Curiosity overriding her exhaustion, she knelt and grabbed the stiff, filthy edge of the rug. It weighed a ton, waterlogged and stiffened by decades of accumulated dirt, but she managed to roll it back. Beneath the rug, perfectly flush with the oak floorboards, was a heavy iron ring set into a square wooden trapdoor. Madeline's heart performed a slow, heavy thump against her ribs. Evelyn had mentioned the cabin had no foundation, just dirt and crawl space. There was no basement on the blueprints. She gripped the iron ring and pulled. It didn't move. She brushed away a thick layer of dust and grime at the edge of the seam, revealing a massive military-grade steel padlock securing a heavy iron latch. It wasn't a standard lock. It was industrial, covered in a green patina of oxidation, and stamped deeply into the brass casing was a name and a year, H. Caldwell, 1944. Madeline stared at the date. 1944. The exact year Evelyn said the property was abandoned. What was so important that it had to be sealed away beneath a rug, locked under military steel, and left to rot in the deep woods for 80 years? The next morning, Madeline drove the 20 torturous miles down the mountain into the small town of Oakhaven. The town was little more than a single main street, a post office, and a hardware store that looked like it hadn't updated its inventory since the Reagan administration. She walked into the hardware store and dropped a heavy-duty angle grinder and 3 masonry cutting wheels onto the counter. The owner, an older man with a weathered face and a name tag that read Tobias, raised an eyebrow at the equipment. "Doing some serious remodeling up there?" Tobias asked, ringing up the purchase. "Something like that," Madeline replied carefully. "I bought the old cabin up on the ridge, the Caldwell place." Tobias stopped scanning the items. The friendly demeanor instantly drained from his face, replaced by a guarded, almost warning look. "You bought the Caldwell tract? Lord Almighty. Evelyn actually found a buyer for that cursed dirt." "Cursed?" Madeline asked, leaning against the counter. "Evelyn said the original owner just abandoned it." Tobias let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Abandoned is a polite word for it. Harrison Caldwell didn't just leave. He vanished. Back in the early 40s, Caldwell was a big-time industrialist, but everyone in this valley knew he was running a shadow operation. He was an associate of some very powerful, very dangerous men. Whispers were, he was laundering money and hoarding unregistered war bonds for private tycoons trying to hide their wealth from the federal government during the war. In November of 1944, the Treasury Department sent investigators up this mountain. They found the cabin empty, a half-eaten meal on the table, and not a single trace of Caldwell. Never found his body. Never found the money, either. Madeline felt a cold prickle of adrenaline wash over her. She paid for the grinder in cash, her mind racing back to the iron trapdoor. By mid-afternoon, she was back in the cabin, the roar of the angle grinder shattering the profound silence of the woods. Sparks rained down on the oak floorboards in a brilliant cascade as she forced the diamond-tipped blade into the hardened steel of the padlock. It took nearly 45 minutes of agonizing, bone-rattling vibration, but finally, the heavy lock snapped with a sharp crack. Madeline tossed the scorching hot metal aside with a pair of leather work gloves. She took a deep breath, grabbed her flashlight, and pulled the iron ring. The trapdoor groaned, resisting for a moment before giving way, revealing a pitch-black square. A rush of cold, perfectly dry air pushed up from the darkness. It didn't smell like mold or damp earth. It smelled like ozone, machine oil, and old paper. She angled the flashlight down. Instead of a dirt cellar, the beam caught the dull grey sheen of poured, reinforced concrete steps leading down into the earth. It wasn't a basement, It was a bunker. Madeline descended slowly, each step echoing loudly in the confined space. At the bottom of the stairs, her flashlight illuminated a room roughly the size of her living area upstairs, completely encased in thick concrete. The air here was perfectly preserved, shielded from the relentless Oregon moisture by some sort of incredible pre-war waterproofing. The room was organized with terrifying precision. Along the left wall sat a massive, dust-covered radio transmitter station, complete with vacuum tubes and a telegraph key. Stacks of heavy wooden crates, stamped with faded serial numbers, lined the back wall. But it was the right wall that made Madeline's breath catch in her throat. Embedded directly into the concrete was a colossal double-door Mosler bank safe. It was matte black, featuring brass combination dials that caught the beam of her flashlight. Mosler safes were legendary, the kind of vaults built to withstand dynamite and bank robbers. Madeline walked toward it, her boots kicking up small clouds of 80-year-old dust. Resting on a small steel desk next to the vault was a leather-bound ledger. The leather was dry and brittle. She opened it carefully, the binding cracking loudly in the silent bunker. The pages were filled with meticulous, hand-written accounting, columns of dates, massive dollar amounts, and strange coded initials. As she turned to the final entry, dated November the 12th, 1944, her eyes landed on a loose document folded inside the pages. She carefully unfolded it. It was a heavily watermarked official letterhead from the Department of the Treasury. At the bottom, signed in stark black ink, was the signature of Henry Morgenthau, Jr., the United States Secretary of the Treasury at the time. The letter authorized the emergency transport of $3 million in gold bullion, an amount worth staggering tens of millions today. Madeline stared at the paper, her hands trembling. This wasn't local folklore. Caldwell hadn't run away. He had hidden everything right here. She stepped closer to the massive Mosler safe, reaching out to brush the thick layer of dust off the brass dial. Suddenly, the absolute silence of the bunker was broken. Directly above her head, coming from the living room she had just vacated, Madeline heard the distinct, heavy creak of an oak floorboard. Someone was walking inside her cabin. Madeline froze, her hand still resting on the cold brass of the vault. She clicked off her flashlight, plunging the bunker into absolute, suffocating darkness. She held her breath, straining her ears. Creak. The footstep was deliberate, slow, moving closer to the open trapdoor. She was miles from civilization, completely alone, standing in a tomb filled with the kind of wealth that men killed for. And as a shadow slowly eclipsed the faint grey light spilling down the concrete stairs, Madeline realized with horrifying clarity that Harrison Caldwell's secret hadn't just been waiting for her. It had been waiting for them. The heavy, agonizingly slow tread of a leather boot against the distressed oak floorboards echoed through the subterranean chamber like the beating of a monstrous mechanical heart. Madeline pressed her spine against the freezing, damp concrete wall, sliding backward until she was entirely concealed behind the towering stacks of decaying wooden crates. The air, previously smelling only of ancient paper and machine oil, was suddenly pierced by the sharp, metallic scent of her own rising panic. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the primal urge to scream. Her fingers gripping the heavy steel of the flashlight she dared not illuminate. Above her, the rusted hinges of the trap-door let out a piercing, tortured shriek. The intruder had found the entrance. A blinding, icy white beam from a high-lumen tactical flashlight sliced through the 80-year-old darkness, cutting a brilliant, dust-moted cone through the stagnant bunker air. The beam swept violently back and forth, illuminating the massive Mosler Bank safe, the meticulously organized vacuum tube radio station, and the scattered pages of Harrison Caldwell's forgotten ledger. Then came the footsteps, descending the poured concrete stairs with a terrifying, calculated rhythm. Madeline peeked through a narrow gap between two rotting pine crates. The man who stepped onto the bunker floor was imposing, clad entirely in dark, water-resistant tactical gear that practically repelled the ambient gloom. He held a suppressed, matte black automatic pistol in his right hand, the weapon moving in perfect, lethal synchronization with the flashlight in his left. He moved with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a professional contractor, someone intimately familiar with violence and the grim logistics of making problems disappear deep within the Pacific Northwest wilderness. "I know you are down here, Madeline," the man said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that lacked any trace of empathy. It was a voice accustomed to issuing absolute ultimatums. "There is precisely one way out of this cellar. You can walk out right now and we can have a civilized conversation, or I can start systematically shooting into the dark. I assure you my ammunition supply vastly exceeds your luck." Madeline's lungs burned as she suppressed a ragged gasp. How did he know her name? She had paid cash for the angle grinder. She had spoken to absolutely no one except Tobias at the hardware store and the real estate agent. Before she could process the implication, a sharp burst of static erupted from a compact radio clipped to the intruder's tactical vest. "Garrett, report. Did you secure the perimeter? Have you found the buyer?" The voice crackling through the tiny speaker was heavily distorted by the dense concrete walls, yet the cadence and the unmistakable sharp nasal inflection were instantly recognizable. It was Evelyn Reed, the supposedly folksy, well-meaning local real estate agent who had practically begged Madeline not to buy the property. The man, Garrett, keyed his radio microphone, never lowering his weapon. "I am in the vault room now. The trapdoor padlock was severed. She is down here hiding like a cornered animal. Stand by, Evelyn. I am going to flush her out and acquire the combination." "Do not make a mess, Garrett," Evelyn's voice replied, dripping with a cold, aristocratic impatience that shattered her small-town persona. "My grandfather spent 80 years waiting to recover what Harrison Caldwell stole from our syndicate. That gold belongs to the remnants of the Lansky operation, not some miserable, divorced architect from Chicago. Get the ledger, open the Mosler, then take care of the girl." The revelation hit Madeline with the force of a physical blow. Evelyn wasn't a random broker. She was syndicate royalty. She had deliberately listed the cursed Caldwell tract at an impossibly low price, entirely unadvertised to the broader public, specifically fishing for an out-of-town buyer desperate enough to purchase it sight unseen. Madeline wasn't just a homeowner. She was the unwitting bait, the expendable contractor brought in to legally purchase the land and unknowingly break the 80-year-old seal on the property, so Evelyn's family could legally seize the assets through a shadow corporation once Madeline inevitably met with a tragic wilderness accident. Garrett took a menacing step toward the wooden crates. "Last chance, Madeline. I am walking toward the radio station." She needed a weapon. She desperately scanned the immediate darkness surrounding her. To her left, resting against the foundation of the radio equipment, was a heavy, cast-iron pipe wrench, left behind by whoever had installed the backup generator nearly a century ago. It was coated in a thick, greasy layer of oxidized rust, but it weighed at least 8 pounds. Madeline silently shifted her weight, her fingertips brushing the freezing iron handle. She grasped it firmly. She was not the same broken woman who had fled Chicago. She was fighting for her life in a tomb designed by a ghost. Garrett's flashlight beam swept across the edge of the crates, missing Madeline's shoulder by absolute fractions of an inch. He was directly in front of her now, his back momentarily turned as he inspected the massive brass dials of the Mosler safe. He holstered his flashlight, pulling a small, folding piece of paper from his tactical vest, likely the vault combination Evelyn had inherited or acquired. It was a terrifying, infinitesimal window of opportunity. Madeline lunged from the shadows with a ferocious, guttural scream, swinging the heavy iron pipe wrench with every ounce of adrenaline-fueled leverage her body could generate. The heavy iron connected brutally with the back of Garrett's right knee. He let out a sharp roar of agonizing pain, his leg collapsing instantly beneath him. As he fell, his pistol discharged, the suppressed shot letting out a violent thwip that sent a high-velocity hollow-point round ricocheting dangerously off the impenetrable steel casing of the Mosler vault, showering the dark bunker in a brilliant, momentary cascade of yellow sparks. Before the professional contractor could recover his balance, Madeline swung the heavy wrench a second time, bringing the cast-iron head crashing down onto the wrist holding the firearm. The sickening crunch of fracturing bone echoed off the concrete walls. The pistol clattered harmlessly away into the darkness beneath the wooden crates. Garrett grunted, attempting to strike her with his uninjured left arm. But Madeline, fueled by sheer, unadulterated survival instinct, shoved him backward with all her strength. His head collided violently with the solid concrete wall behind the safe. His eyes rolled back, and he slumped heavily onto the cold floor, completely incapacitated. Madeline stood over the unconscious mercenary, her chest heaving violently, the iron wrench still trembling uncontrollably in her tightly clenched fists. She stared at the man, the silence of the underground bunker rushing back in to deafen her. She had survived, but the nightmare was far from over. Madeline did not waste a single precious second. She immediately retrieved a length of thick, braided copper electrical wire from the abandoned radio station and methodically, securely bound Garrett's hands and ankles. She confiscated his tactical flashlight, his two-way radio, and a heavy set of keys clipped to his belt. She shoved the unconscious man's radio deep into her jacket pocket, turning the volume dial to absolute zero so Evelyn's frantic check-ins wouldn't betray her position. Now the bunker belonged entirely to her. She turned her attention back to the colossal, matte black Mosler Bank vault. Garrett had dropped the folded slip of paper when she struck him. Madeline knelt, retrieved the document, and smoothed it out under the beam of the tactical flashlight. It contained a series of 4 complex, numerical sequences, followed by a final set of mechanical instructions. She stepped up to the vault. The brass dial was freezing against her fingertips, covered in an incredibly fine layer of 80-year-old dust that she carefully wiped away. The mechanical precision of the lock was breathtaking. As she spun the heavy brass dial to the left, the internal tumblers engaged with a series of heavy, satisfying metallic clicks that resonated deep within the solid steel door. Left to 42. Click. Right to 17. Click. Left to 89. Click. Right to 0. Madeline grasped the massive, lever-action handle on the front of the safe. She braced her boots against the concrete floor, took a deep breath, and pulled downward with her entire body weight. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The 80-year-old locking mechanism stubbornly resisted. Then, with a deep, echoing groan that sounded like a submarine shifting under extreme atmospheric pressure, the massive internal locking bolts retracted. The colossal heavy steel door swung outward on its perfectly balanced, greased hinges, revealing the pitch-black interior of the pre-war vault. Madeline aimed the high-lumen tactical flashlight into the cavernous space. She gasped, stumbling backward a half-step. The legends were entirely, unequivocally true, stacked meticulously from the floor to the ceiling, gleaming with a dull, mesmerizing, indestructible yellow luster beneath the flashlight beam, were hundreds of heavy, rectangular gold bullion bars. Each brick was precisely stamped with the iconic seal of the United States Mint and the year 1943. It was a staggering, incomprehensible fortune. A king's ransom hidden beneath the decaying floorboards of an Oregon cabin, perfectly preserved through decades of rain, rot, and forgotten history. But as Madeline stepped closer, utterly captivated by the staggering wealth, she noticed something else. Resting squarely on top of the largest stack of gold bullion was a series of thick, tightly bound leather portfolios, sealed heavily with red wax. She carefully lifted the top portfolio. It was incredibly heavy, filled with hundreds of pages of densely typed documents, black and white photographs, and carbon copy financial ledgers. She broke the brittle red wax seal and flipped open the heavy leather cover. What she read sent an entirely new, icy chill cascading down her spine. The gold was undeniably valuable, but the documents were explosive. They were the ultimate insurance policy. Harrison Caldwell had not just been laundering money for Meyer Lansky and the East Coast crime syndicates. He had been meticulously, obsessively documenting a massive covert network of treasonous financial transactions during the height of the Second World War. The files contained undeniable, hard-copy evidence of prominent American industrialists, high-ranking wartime politicians, and even associates of legendary figures like J. Edgar Hoover, actively profiteering and engaging in illicit, back-channel arms trading with European fascist regimes while the world burned. This was the real reason Harrison Caldwell had vanished. This was the reason Evelyn Reed's syndicate family had spent nearly a century desperately hunting for the cabin. They didn't just want the lost millions in gold bullion. They desperately needed to destroy the paper trail that could systematically dismantle their inherited emperors and expose the foundational rot of their generational wealth to the federal government. Madeline carefully packed the most critical leather portfolios and a single, heavy gold bar into her sturdy canvas duffel bag. She knew she could not simply drive back into Oakhaven. Evelyn would have the mountain roads heavily watched. If she went to the local sheriff, she risked stepping directly into a syndicate payroll. She needed a federal intervention, and she needed it immediately. Leaving the still unconscious Garrett securely bound in the vault room, Madeline carefully locked the massive Mosler safe behind her, spinning the dials to reset the complex tumblers. She ascended the concrete stairs, bursting through the trapdoor into the dusty, decaying living room of her cabin. The storm outside had escalated into a massive, torrential downpour, the heavy rain hammering aggressively against the moss-covered roof. She sprinted to her Subaru, tossing the heavy canvas duffel bag onto the passenger seat. The engine roared to life, the tires desperately gripping the muddy, treacherous mountain terrain. She didn't drive toward the small, corrupted town of Oakhaven. Instead, she navigated her vehicle entirely off-road, utilizing the abandoned, overgrown logging trails she had studied on satellite maps before arriving in Oregon, forging a dangerous, muddy path straight across the unforgiving county line. 48 hours later, Madeline Hayes sat quietly in a sterile, brilliantly lit conference room located inside the highly secure Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in downtown Portland. Across the heavy mahogany table sat 3 severe-looking federal agents belonging to the Bureau's specialized art crime and historical recovery team, alongside a senior prosecutor for the United States Department of Justice. The explosive documents were carefully laid out across the table in protective archival sleeves. The single, heavily stamped 1943 gold bar sat heavily in the center, a gleaming testament to the undeniable truth of her incredible story. The legal aftermath was swift and devastatingly absolute. The FBI raided the Caldwell tract at dawn, utilizing a heavily armed tactical unit. They recovered the incapacitated Garrett Knox, who immediately turned state's evidence to avoid a federal life sentence. Evelyn Reed was arrested without incident at her lavish waterfront estate, effectively ending the remnants of an 80-year-old criminal dynasty with a single sweeping federal indictment. The recovery of the stolen bullion became one of the most significant, highly publicized historical seizures in the history of the United States. Because Madeleine had legally purchased the property, and the original treasonous owners were entirely defunct, the complex federal treasure trove laws ultimately ruled partially in her favor. While the explosive historical documents were permanently classified and absorbed into the National Archives, Madeleine was legally awarded a staggering multi-million-dollar finder's fee by the United States Treasury Department for the secure recovery of the lost wartime gold. Madeleine never returned to the dark, decaying cabin in the unforgiving Oregon woods, nor did she ever return to her hollow, shattered life in Chicago. She purchased a breathtaking, ultra-modern architectural masterpiece overlooking the serene, crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean. She started her own fiercely independent architectural firm, completely untethered from the ghosts of her past and the controlling shadow of her ex-husband. She had driven into the deep, isolated wilderness, seeking an empty, forgotten place to disappear from the world. Instead, beneath the rotting floorboards of history, Madeleine Hayes had violently unearthed a dangerous fortune, completely rewriting her destiny in the cold, unyielding concrete of a forgotten vault. If you were captivated by Madeleine's incredible fight for survival and her unbelievable historical discovery, hit that like button to support these real-life mysteries. Share this thrilling story with your friends who love true crime, hidden treasures, and shocking historical